What is going on, everybody? Clayton Sayfie here with EJ Holland. We're from the Wolverine.com. Make sure to check us out over at the Wolverine.com. Use promo code BLUE60 to get your first 60 days of our premium content for free. Today we are talking some recruiting here. Rayshaun Benny, Rivals 100 defensive tackle, one of the top targets remaining here in 2021 for Michigan in that cycle that's starting to be wrapped up a bit. Donovan Edwards, really the other top guy there in 2021. But we'll talk about the latest with him, where Michigan stands, some other things with him, with top contenders, his timeline. But EJ, give us the latest here. I know you had an update on our site, and that went a little more in depth on some insider notes with the latest on Rayshaun Benny. But what is the latest here in his recruitment?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like he's one of the more interesting guys from a personality standpoint. You know, you see him in person and he actually talks a lot, but away from that, he's very quiet. I've heard from multiple sources, and not just at Michigan, but from others elsewhere that are recruiting him. I've heard that college coaches in general have a tough time really communicating with him. Rayshawn's not a big communicator. He's quiet. He plays things really close to the vest. So I think a lot of people are having a tough time getting a true read on where they stand with Benny. With that said, you know, the dead period was extended through the end of the calendar year. Benny's always been a guy that's been adamant about taking visits elsewhere. Just really wants to see the schools that are recruiting him. I mean, who wouldn't? And so with that being extended, I think it actually helps Michigan because he has the most familiarity with Michigan. He's developed a really good relationship with the coaching staff. When I went out and saw him, he talked a lot about his bond with Sean Nua, Michigan's defensive line coach, as well as area recruiter Sharon Moore. So I think Michigan's in a really good spot for him. I put in my future cast for him a few months ago. I still think if Rayshaun had to commit today, it would be Michigan, but there are some other schools involved, and he's just like fellow defensive line target George Rooks. They're both just kind of not necessarily wild cards. They just both. It wouldn't be surprising to see them do anything at this point. Both of them are just guys that are extremely difficult to gauge.
So, yeah, and like you said, that's kind of the read that coaches maybe at Michigan and around the country have had on him, that he's more of that quiet kid. So, kind of tough to pull things out of him. But who would those other top contenders be outside of Michigan? I know you feel confident that if it were today, it would be the Wolverines. But at the same time, who are some of those other major players for Rayshaun Benny's services?
Yeah, so Penn State was considered a really big contender in his recruitment. I recently wrote that Penn State's dropped off a little bit, mostly because Benny prefers to be a defensive lineman. And honestly, I think that's where his biggest upside is at. But Penn State apparently disagrees. They like him more as an offensive lineman. And so I think he's kind of cooled a little bit on Penn State, which is, great news for Michigan. But still, some SEC schools are involved. Kentucky is a big player, might be the biggest threat to Michigan at this time. Kentucky's had a lot of success at Oak Park. They surprised some people by landing Justin Rogers there last year, who is a five-star, according to Rivals. Kentucky's had previous success at Oak Park as well. So Kentucky's definitely one to watch. Arkansas is another school that's been really, really recruiting Benny hard, and Sam Pittman, the coach there, has been personally reaching out to Benny, and I think they knew each other from his time at Georgia as well. So those two schools are definitely ones to watch in his recruitment. Arizona State is kind of on that outside looking in. I think Benny just wanted to visit because it's Arizona State, but they've definitely been recruiting him hard, and Herm Edwards is actually doing a really nice job on the recruiting trail. And lastly, I'd say Michigan State is the other school that's in it. There's less familiarity with the coaching staff there, with Mel Tucker still being in his first full cycle, but at the same time, they are pitching him on being the face of the class, like really, bringing in the Mel Tucker era. So that's something that could be appealing to him. But, I think Michigan, with that big game against Michigan State on Halloween, can really make a statement in that recruitment with a win. And, as far as a a timeline, Benny's been kind of all over the place with it. He wanted to do it in December, but with no visits. I mean, he's a guy that could string it all the way down to February and, make a decision on regular signing day. So it'll be interesting to see what his timeline looks like. Even with that said, now that there's no visits, he could just say, you know what, I'm tired of this and commit to Michigan. So with him, there are just a lot of unknowns right now. But, what is known is what I just said. Those are the schools that are still very, very involved in the recruitment.
I think Benny's recruitment is kind of interesting from a Michigan perspective because he's a super important recruit. And I know you're on record basically saying that you think he's the most important target on Michigan's board right now because of what defensive tackle has looked like. They haven't really landed a true defensive tackle. I mean, there's some guys that are going to, probably slide down from maybe a strong side defensive end spot and play the 3 technique and things like that. But in terms of a guy that can really dominate that interior and is already kind of almost ready to do that, Rayshaun Benny would be that guy. Also in state, we've seen that narrative come about that Michigan can't land the elite kids in its own state, protect its own backyard. Let's say Michigan ends up landing him whenever that is. I mean, like you said, he could take that thing all the way into 2021, the beginning months there before the late signing period. But just how important is it that Michigan does capitalize on a guy like Rayshaun Benny?
Yeah, it's super important from a positional standpoint and a perspective standpoint. I mean, he is the guy that can be that 3 tech that Michigan hasn't necessarily, landed successfully the last couple of cycles. I mean, even though Rayshawn's listed as an offensive lineman on Rivals, it's been clear that his future is along the defensive line. And every school recruiting him other than Penn State is recruiting him along the defensive line. So that should probably change, but it's not up to me to change the profiles. But yeah, he should definitely be a defensive lineman and for sure a 3 tech. I mean, he's already up to about 280 pounds, so he could easily play at 300 pounds and potentially be that mammoth that everybody wants. So I feel like Benny's definitely a guy that would fill that role and is an elite level talent. So that's why I think he's more so important than Donovan because, Michigan already has a pretty good running back room. Defensive tackle is a big need. And then from a perception standpoint, you're dipping into Oak Park, and that's, a school where you need to build some inroads for the future as well. And it makes a statement landing a kid out of Oak Park and a top 100 kid like Benny. So even though Benny's not the most vocal guy, I think just earning a commitment from him would send some shockwaves around, that local narrative and at least quiet it down a bit. I mean, if you land Benny and Edwards, it's kind of a wrap there.
Yeah, the narrative would at least be stymied, for the time being. I was actually out at West Bloomfield against Oak Park last weekend. Of course, Rayshaun Benny did not play with an injury, but just observing him, I mean, you mentioned he's a quiet kid, but in person, he talks quite a bit. Just observing him on the sideline, it was a tough night for Oak Park, who lost 39-0 to West Bloomfield, who's obviously a loaded team. But Rayshaun Benny was picking those guys up. There were some guys after some big plays for Oak Park that one guy after a touchdown grab that he allowed, a defensive back was kind of on the ground just holding his head, laying there. And Benny obviously wasn't on the field to pick him up, but there were guys on the sideline that Rayshaun Benny was pulling aside and talking to. So I kind of wanted to see that out of him as well. So he's definitely still a leader, even though he's one of those more quiet guys. And of course, if Michigan finishes with Donovan Edwards and Rayshaun Benny, it'd be a huge conclusion to the class in 2021 to really put a nice stamp on it, especially that in-state stamp. So yeah, that's the latest there with Rayshaun Benny, Rivals 100 defensive tackle, one of the top remaining guys for Michigan there in 2021. For more on Benny and other Michigan targets, you get EJ's notes, all of our premium content over at thewolverine.com using promo code Blue60. But we'll see everybody next time here on Wolverine TV.